and welcome to History Through Fiction, the podcast. I'm your host, Colin Mustful, and today I'm thrilled to be joined by Janet Rich Edwards, author of Canticle. Janet, welcome.
Thank you so much. This is really a thrill.
Well, I want to start with the historical context and setting. Where are we and what's going on in that time and place?
Absolutely. We are really on the cusp of the turn of the 14th century. So the year is in and around 1299, and we are set in Bruges in the Low Countries, also known as Flanders at that time.
And what about that historical time and place made you write a story set there?
It is such an interesting moment in history. This is sort of the high Middle Ages, where you've got this growth in a burgeoning middle class of merchants, and it's starting to come into conflict with the church, which really ruled everything, was the height of the Roman Catholic Church's power. And you've got this um, the incredible mix of people who want to get closer to God, but are fed up with the church's sort of creating a barrier for them. And you've got merchants who are for the first time learning to read, and in reading, they question. And so it's this time of sort of spiritual and political upheaval that most of us don't know much about. And when I discovered it, I was absolutely fascinated.
So tell us about your main character, Aleys, who you use to tell this story. I'm curious because a lot of the authors I interview, their stories are based on real historical figures, documented people. Is Aleys documented historical figure in any way, or is she completely fictional? And tell me about your process of getting to know her in order to tell the story.
Yeah. So she is not a historical figure, but she's inspired by one. So there was a woman, Marguerite Porete, who in the 13th century wrote a book. It's called A Mirror of Simple Souls. And it's this fascinating book. It's amazing that it survived. It's, this sort of dialogue between love and reason and the soul. And it really puts sort of love and direct spiritual connections above the church. And you can imagine this got under the church's skin. And they had her burn it once. They sort of declared it heretical. She rewrote it, and she was arrested again and put on trial. This is sort of early Inquisition material in Paris. And for 18 months, they grilled her about her book, and she stood silent until finally they called her an unrepentant heretic and they burned her and her book at the stake. But the amazing thing is she must have secreted a copy of it away with a friend. This is before the printing press. This is when everything is handwritten. And that book got passed from hand to hand and copied throughout Europe. And for centuries, probably 6 centuries, it was attributed to a man until a scholar in 1946 realized this was Marguerite Porete, who'd been executed. So she has the dubious distinction of being, both executed and erased for nearly 600 years. And she was the character that intrigued me so much. Like, what would I die for? She made me confront, do I believe anything so strongly that I would die for it? And I was fascinated by her. And there's very little known about her life other than she was a Beguine, which I'm sure we'll talk about, that sort of growing sect of women who were independent. Um, and so Aleys is my attempt to imagine what her life might have been like. Although I don't have Aleys writing whole book, in that sense. But um, it was just this fascination with these women who are claiming authority over the church, which is an incredibly bold and frankly dangerous thing to do at the time.
Well, that's amazing. And I'm curious, what views was she expressing that were heretical or considered so out of bounds?
So she and actually other women mystics like her were often expressing that the potential for sort of union with God, and that once a soul sort of perfected itself, mostly by vanquishing one's own ego, that you sort of at some point were so in communication with the divine that you became exempt from sort of worldly regulations, including some of the church's edicts. It wasn't meant to go around them. The notion was that you became so sort of perfected, you just didn't need them because you weren't going to do those things anyway. But that did not sit well with the church. And in her book, Marguerite Porete has really poses this notion of love as being higher than reason, which is actually the sort of medieval church with the capital C, and like love completely vanquishes reason in this book. And so it was a radical book.
Oh, wouldn't that be nice to have immunity from God's wrath, I guess?
Yeah, yeah.
So tell me more about Aleys and how you used that historical information in order to have a vehicle here to teach people about what life was like for a young woman at that time and how what she went through that she eventually became one of these Beguines that you mentioned.
Yeah, so Elise is a headstrong young woman. She's prone to mystical visions. We see her fleeing an unwanted marriage, and she finds shelter with the Beguines, this community of women that I'm sure we'll spend time talking about. When she begins to perform what might be miracles, the rising fervor of the town attracts the attention of an ambitious local bishop. And so Aleys and her sisters, the Beguines, become entangled in both political and spiritual upheaval that tests their faith and courage. Um, Aleys herself is a little bit of an amalgam of several female mystics. There were about 400 years, roughly 1100 to 1550, when there was a run of women who claimed to have divine showings, or visions or conversations with God. And how this played out for the women varied tremendously. So you've got characters like the historical person, Matilde of Magdeburg, who sort of, advised popes, or Catherine of Siena, who advised popes. And, they get away with saying things like, priests are stinking billy goats. But you get other characters like Marjorie of Kemp, who's, belittled as having a distempered brain, or Marguerite Porete, who's actually burned for her words. So if you claimed such showings, you could be either named sort of a heretic or like a vessel of God. And I think it has a lot to do, how it played out, honestly, with sort of your connections with some of the male um, led church institutions. So if you had a scribe who was from a respected monastery, writing down your words, you were more likely to get, those words accepted than if you were somebody like Marguerite Porete, who's sort of doing it, on the down low.
As I was looking into all of this, I got me to wonder about translations and what impact did those translations from 13th century have on what we practice today? Because I'm sure things, like a game of telephone get changed up over time. Can you draw that connection?
So in the high Middle Ages, the only people who spoke Latin, which was the only language in which the Bible was available, were people trained in monasteries or nunneries, and some priests. In fact, most priests, your average village priest, didn't understand much more than the Latin prayers they'd sort of memorized. And local people became increasingly interested in reading the Bible for themselves. And so a few educated people would take it upon themselves to produce these sort of scraps of translations of Bible stories, uh, sometimes approved by the church, but a lot of times not approved by the church. The church was very nervous about having people read scripture for themselves. And they had, in fact, forbidden these, what is it, basically occult conventicles. There's a Latin word for it. Where people would be reading and debating scripture among themselves without the supervision of a priest. Those were forbidden. So there was a lot of control by the church over who had access to what parts of the Bible. Like you might have a prayer book, an illuminated Psalter, and a Psalter features prominently in Canticle that gives you the prayers in Latin for the offices of the hour during the day, just sort of, the prayers you would do throughout the day. Um, and everybody knew the Latin for, Our Father who art in heaven, Pater Noster. Everybody knew that. But beyond that, the Bible was, you know, pretty far away from people's lives. But because they're getting more literate during this time period, people are getting more and more interested in what it actually says.
And just to continue on that, um, with the church's control over these translations, did they kind of skew then what was translated and what it said to kind of benefit the church and away from being more authentic?
You know, I think, as far as I know, it's a really good question. And we should probably ask a proper scholar for that. I think, as far as I know, the church, when it did provide translations or approve them, um, they were genuine translations. I don't think they were trying to hide anything, but they were very uncomfortable. If you take the Waldensians, who in this century, it's the early 13th century, um, were translating the Bible for themselves into vernacular and noticed that the word Pope doesn't appear in the Bible ever. And they started challenging the legitimacy of the Pope. And that, as we know, got a whole bunch of them burned um, at the stake. And that was a movement that was suppressed by the church, I think, because it challenged the church's power.
Well, it's clear that you've done a lot of research for Canticle. It's very interesting, fascinating stuff, but you've got to make it into a compelling narrative for readers to make it fiction. Can you talk a little bit about your background and your transition from nonfiction academics into fiction?
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to. So my day job, I'm an epidemiologist, a professor of epidemiology. So I write scientific articles, for journals, and that's so formulaic. You've got your sections of a journal article. You know, when I turned 50, I sort of wanted to try a new trick, and I started, just writing fiction. I'd always been a reader of fiction, and I wrote a sentence and another sentence, and I loved it, and I kind of didn't want to stop. Um, so I have these two kinds of writing in my life, and the only way I really make it work is I kind of put up a firewall between them. I never cross over during my day. Um, the fiction writing is like a skydive, like a free fall compared to the scientific writing. The scientific writing is all deduction, and the fiction writing is induction. It's the other kind of creativity. Both are creative, but they're very different.
And you attended Grub Street's novel incubator program. Tell me about why that was necessary and what you took away from it.
Oh, Grub Street has this fabulous program. It's called the Novel Incubator. It's kind of an MFA level program focused on the novel, exclusively on the novel, and they take 10 novelists with first drafts. You compete to get into it, and you spend the year revising your novel, learning how to critique each other's work. There's a fabulous leader of it, Michelle Hoover, who's sort of like the novel whisperer. She can like diagnose exactly what you need. And you come out of it with a much more sophisticated draft and a whole lot more skills and a writing community. And that's the biggest part of it. I did the novel incubator, better part of 10 years ago, and we're still together as a writing group. And that I had to learn the craft. It's a craft. Writing fiction is a craft, and there are things to learn and lots of practice to do. And that got me started.
Yeah, well, I mean, I know personally because I had to learn the hard way. I wrote several novels before I went back to school for an MFA in creative writing, and just learned how intricate that craft is. So, did you have some kind of starts and stops along the way? Did you have some points where you thought, no, I can't do this fiction stuff? Or was it kind of smooth sailing for you, just a long process?
Well, I don't think it's smooth sailing for anyone. Well, first of all, I have two novels in the drawer, and they may never come out of the drawer. So this is my third novel. Of the three, I would say this one probably wrote the most smoothly. Um, they've all been historical fiction. They've all required a lot of research, which I enjoy doing. It's just like I'm sure all your authors say like it's so hard to stop the research. It's such a rabbit hole. It's so fun. Um, so this one required as much research as the others, but the actual writing came a little easier. It was also important once we sold the novel and I had an editor at Spiegel and Grau, Joey McGarvey, who's fabulous. I would say that's when I hit the biggest bumps because Joey took a look at sort of the main pivot point in the novel, which happens, about 2/3 of the way through. And she says, I just don't believe Aleys would do that. And I'm thinking, wait, everything hangs on this, that this choice is incredibly important. And of course she would make it, that she eventually convinced me that Aleys would have made the other choice. And so I went back to my blank notebook and I wrote what if at the top of several pages. And I just started scrawling different possibilities of what would happen if she'd made the other choice. And Joey was right. It was true to her character and it ended up being the better story. So for me, the bumps came almost in the process once I had, a professional editor.
That's really interesting. That I think it's important for people to hear that even once you land a publishing deal, like there's still so much more work to do. Because were you kind of tired of it? I mean, it sounds like at first you thought, oh, come on, do we really need to do this? And then you took a while to be convinced.
I was resistant, but honestly, it took me only a couple of days of that brainstorming, and I trusted her. She's a great editor, and um, she had made a point. So this is a point at which Aleys is choosing between um, a choice where she might be excommunicated versus something which threatens her own personal integrity. And I had her choose not to be excommunicated. But I've told you she's a mystic and she does have these showings. And even though at the moment that this choice comes up, she's sort of in the dark night of the soul where it's been a little while since she's heard from God and she's really worried. Um, my editor convinced me this is a woman who's been talking to God. She would make this other choice. She would risk formal excommunication by the church in order to stay sort of true to uh, herself and to sort of her vision of God.
I work with a lot of writers who are kind of come from your background, from my background, with history as their main background, less so writers that come with a fictional background. What advice do you have for them in kind of shifting their perspective to write a fiction novel, even though you have such a strong background in the history and the science and the academic process?
Yeah, I think obviously, and people who listen to your podcast have heard many authors say, you have to research all the detail, but you can't put it in your book. It really gums up the book. So I think you need to immerse yourself in the history, be prepared to learn a whole lot and then abandon it, except for as it flavors your book. And I think you just have to sink into imagining the worldview of the people you're writing about. And, in the case of the 13th century, it was really a challenge to sink into the worldview where, religion is everything. There are basically no atheists that I know of, and it runs the politics, it runs, you know, whether you're going to go to heaven or hell, it runs your, what you can call your children. It's really all powerful. And it's, I think, very hard for a modern reader, myself included, to understand what that would be like. And so I think one of the biggest challenges is taking being true to a mindset of an era but bringing it forward so that modern readers can access it. So I think keeping your eye both on the history and on the voice you need to bridge the history and a modern reader's ears is really important and kind of the challenge.
Yeah, no, it's definitely tempting to throw all that history in there. It's like I want to show off how much I learned, but
Totally.
then you'll lose readers. So for the reader that does sit down and get to know Elise and her story, what ultimately do you want them to come away with? What revelation, what message or theme? How should they be feeling by the end of this novel?
So I think that the novel shows us, because Aleys and her sisters, the Beguines, go through some real threats and some real challenges that are similar and not similar to what we face today, that the history shows us that people have faced big problems before. And I think it also shows us that people are resourceful. And history reminds us of that. I think the novel really resonates with themes of sisterhood. I think it reminds us of the power in literacy. And I think that it also features a lot of quiet heroes. You know, you've got the loud ones, people who go to the stake, but you've also got, the silent bell ringer. And you've got um, people who are quiet rebels who, just by insisting on living independent lives, are themselves ferocious in a sort of quiet rebellion.
I like that word you use, ferocious, even. It's quiet rebellion. So what's next for you? Are you continuing to work on fiction or you taking a break from it?
Oh, I can't wait to get back to fiction. There's a lot of pre-publication stuff that comes up that like distracts you from writing, and I'm just dying to get back to it. Um, I am eager to write a modern day character. You look around, you see all this stuff around you every day that you want to include in a novel. If you're writing about the 13th century, like you can't. So I'm I've got a modern day historian. Now she is a medieval historian, and she is hot on the trail of the lost manuscript of Dame Julian of Norwich, one of these mystics from the Middle Ages. So I'll be able to do one of those braided timelines. I'm eager to try that.
Yeah, it sounds exciting and maybe yeah, you can rely on some of your own experience in this one to for that character.
Yeah.
Well, Janet, congratulations on Canticle. It's been so much fun to hear about this history, and can't wait to read the novel.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to talk about it and talk about the history with you. I appreciate it.